Expedition 44! Today we are starting a new series. Matt and I have been doing a series on tough topics at our church, and we talk about this one a lot. We allude to it. Most people know that we are both egalitarians. You may not know what that is, but after this video you will. And sometimes people kind of wonder, because it's not really the traditional view, but it's not really a minor view either, at least in scholarly research. And most people, this is interesting, most churches, if you take large churches such as Willow Creek or something like that, they're going to be hugely on the egalitarian side of the fence and not on what people would consider the more traditional side of the fence of complementarianism. So when we're looking at women's roles in the church, we're going to separate this, but this is going to take some time. It's going to be a 4-part series, and today we're just going to explain the different theories behind this, kind of give you a foundation or an introduction of other topics that we're going to go into, and kind of frame it as a little bit of an overview. So with that being said, let's talk about what these two things mean. So first of all, I like to use traditional and minor views because we use those words other times, even though I just said that's not really accurate for this. But the more traditional view would be that of a complementarian. What does that mean?
It's not someone who gives compliments, but it's men and women have different roles, is basically what it is. Roles and responsibilities in family, in life, in marriage, and in religious leadership. So some Christians interpret the Bible as prescribing this. And so what they say when they do this is that men and women are equal in value, but they aren't equal in role. So the phrase is used ontologically equal, but functionally different.
So God is going to be seen as creating men and women very equal, but then some people are going to have specific roles, such as men to lead and teach, and women are going to have other functional roles, in which case are going to be playing B roles or able to
supportive and helping roles.
This gets hard because it's at some point it says, well, they can lead and teach themselves and children and things like that, and then you got to ask where the line is.
They can't teach men is kind of the big thing, and a lot of complementarians will say that some of these questions and stuff that are coming up are good for correcting some bad behavior. But they say that the egalitarians throw out the baby with the bathwater with saying that everyone is equal in function.
So I'm not going to try to be a complementarian, but I am going to give you, just to start, some reasons why you might want to go that way. A lot of times when they just read the Bible in English and they don't really jump into
Greek and Hebrew,
or any textures of interpretation. A lot of people do this.
Culture.
They just pick up their New International Version and they read it. And I am going to say, if you just read it from an English NIV and you have a Western kind of thinking, you're going to get there. You're going to read it and you're going to say, it sounds like God is saying men need to be the head of the church and there's not a place for women and things like that. So I can understand it, but when you really tend to dive into Scripture, which is what we do, you're going to find that doesn't really hold water anymore. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
So the next view is egalitarian, and so in theological spheres, egalitarian means the equality in authority and responsibilities between genders, and this is in contrast to complementarianism. So this entails that women are able to exercise authority as pastors and teachers, and authority in the church, in that mutuality in the household. That's mutuality and mutual submission is really the big thing with this, is that it's not men over women or women over men, but it's mutual authority together.
So one way that we're going to frame this, and I'll frame it from both sides here, is that there really isn't an argument that when God created man and woman, that he created them as priests in the garden. And so a priestly role is what we would call pastors and shepherds and things like that today. And God is going to put both of them there. So throughout the Bible, I'm always looking for pictures of what God says is ideal. God sometimes in the Bible says, this is the way I want it to be. This is the way that I'm going to reveal myself. Other times, he's kind of reacting to what man wants. And he's giving them sometimes what man wants. Sometimes we see him let the world kind of go, and then he shows remorse and things like that. So when you're looking at this perspective, you have to ask the question, what is God's complete ideal way for man and woman to function together and in the church, and what might be a result of a mucked up world that we live in?
Yeah, some of the arguments that egalitarians will make is just like the church took a long time to wake up to slavery being bad and abolishing slavery, it's taken them even longer to kind of wake up, per se, to that women have been oppressed and been pushed down for all these years and not able to lead when God has spiritually gifted them that way. But we also get ditches here. So we can get the ditches of extreme patriarchy, which suppress women, but then we also have the ditch of feminism, which is beating down men. So we have both ditches, and we need to stay out of the ditches.
So there is one way of thinking of this. When you go back to creation, to Genesis 1, and we're going to get into this in a second, but I just want to paint the picture before we get there, that God is going to create Adam and Eve as priests, and he's going to say that as priests, you're going to help me in the order and, kind of rolling over. And then at the end, what starts with Eden looks like this at the end. So at the end, we have a recreated new heaven and earth. And what do we see the picture of looking like? That we together in equal roles are going to be ruling over and continuing to create this kind of order. So everything that happens in the middle is kind of this God returning, getting away from this mucked up version of what happened to the fall of mankind, but also to spiritual entities and everything else. So when I look at God's ideals, I see them as bookends. We have Eden and we have recreated heaven and earth, and it seems to be a very clear picture of priesthood of all believers in an equal role there. Now, we could just leave it at that. We don't need a 4-part series anymore. This is the way God ideally made it. What happens in the middle really doesn't matter because it's not really God's way. It's just mucked up.
That's not the way we are. We like to dive into it. So we're going to do that. I guess a footnote here for this study is that we're going to, this 4-part series, we're going to concentrate really on the role of women in the church and not so much on women and men and the marriage or the home. Marriage
relationship. Now, we have done a little bit of that. So I'm going to link one of the videos that we did on that. We did on Colossians 3, and we got into the house codes and things like that. And that is huge in complementing this discussion. And so at some point during the series, and again, I'll link it in this series, that needs to be viewed because we're going to make several different comments that are going to tie into it.
So if you want more on that, go check out that video. But here, we're really, the only part of this that ties into marriage that we might touch on a little bit is in our next video when we talk about submission and headship. But it's really, we take a little bit from the role within marriage and apply it to the church. So let's jump into Genesis.
All right, Genesis 1:27-28 is where we're going to start. What does it say?
So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground."
So I'm just going to say, just reading this, whether you read it in Hebrew or whether you read it in English, you just get this, we want to read it plainly and say it just seems equal. So then let's keep going. Let's get to Genesis 2 when he gives us a little more detail here.
Then God said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." Now the Lord God formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them, and he named them and called them each living creature what its name is. The man gave names to all the livestock, the birds of the sky, and all the wild animals, but Adam found no suitable helper. So the Lord caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping he took one of the man's ribs, then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib, and he took that he had taken out of the man, and as he brought her to the man said, "Now this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she has been taken out of man." That's why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh.
Okay, so both sides, egalitarians, complementarians, are going to have to start here no matter what. They're both going to go back here, but they're going to interpret this just a little bit differently. And so, foundationally, what do they hold in common? And I've alluded to this already. What they both hold in common is that this picture of a mountaintop garden is going to be the mosaic for purity, for holiness. This is the way God intentionally wanted to create his relationship. And it doesn't matter here. I always feel like people are going to throw me under the bus as a heretic when I even mention this. But it doesn't matter whether you think that Adam and Eve were the first created people or whether there's a whole bunch of other people kind of under the mountain that are doing this. But I mention it because if you think that, it actually does kind of segue into this idea of priests that are getting ready to go and communicate to the rest of the world. So again, that's not going to change our discussion here. It doesn't do much for it, but if you find yourself as an egalitarian, that's one little thing that is actually going to kind of reiterate your thinking that way. It's going to make sense and kind of, there's a lot of connecting the dots in this study, and that's one way that we're going to possibly connect dots if you're thinking that way, but again, that's a very minor view. Not very many people go that way.
Yep. So the first issue that we need to look at in the text here is the issue of the man's rib.
Yeah.
So, sometimes complementarians say since he was taken from his side or a lower part of his side that it communicates submission.
Yeah.
Lower than the man or just a part of it.
Or it might even be taken or connotated that it's a lesser person.
Yeah.
You know, that in God's eyes, you know, it might be saying that Adam was, you know, the pure form of it, and that in some way that Eve would be a part or a lesser part is a better way to say it, a small part. And so ultimately in complementarianism, even though they're saying man and women were created equal, it doesn't really have that flavor to it. It seems like from the beginning they're not actually, they're saying one thing, but then when they're working through it, it seems like they're coming from a different perspective. Before this, Matt sent me a link to John MacArthur.
Saying Beth Moore, go home. Yeah, he was asked. he was asked by Todd Friel at one of the, I think it was Shepherd's Conference, which is his big conference there. He's giving him one or two word things, and he's only allowed to give a one or two word answer. So he says Beth Moore. And John MacArthur's response was, go home. And
he follows it up by pretty much saying, like, you know, women have no place in preaching and teaching in a church. Like, there's no scriptural support for that. And
period is what he says.
Again, like, the only way I can reconcile John MacArthur making what I would call a crazy statement like that is to say he's never read the Bible in its
original context.
Like, there's... You know, and John MacArthur is often given a hard time for not very good...
Bad at Greek, bad at cultural... stuff. He's not a scholar.
We kind of laugh when we hear something like that, yet we hear those things a lot.
From the pulpits,
and this is one of the reasons. Like, they kind of take this rib and they say, even though we're kind of going to say man and woman are equal, we're going to explain it as a lesser part, and... I kind of roll my eyes every time I hear that.
So the question we need to ask is, did Adam think that God took just a rib?
Yeah.
In the context here, it says, no, she's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh.
Yeah.
If he only took a bone, it couldn't be flesh of my flesh.
Yeah.
So the thing we need to look at is, what's the Hebrew word here that is translated here in the NIV we just read from as rib? And that's salah, right?
Yeah.
So this word appears about 40 times in the Hebrew Bible, and it's never an etymological term at all.
Yeah.
Outside of Genesis 2. With the exception of maybe 2 Samuel 16, where it's described as two sides of a hill.
Yeah. So when we look at this word, you know, you can open it up and say, I'm going to look at every time in the Old Testament this word is used, and to take all of them, you tend to get almost like an engineering sense. Like they're talking about the building of the temple, and they're going to have this beam, and they're not saying on the east side of the temple the beams are better than on the west side of the temple or different. They're using the words that are just referring to them as equal parts. These are the parts that are used to make the temple. It's kind of this 50-50 idea,
so
not
the rings on one side of the ark versus the other, the rooms on one side of the temple versus the other, east side of the temple versus the west side of the temple. That's the way that this word is used.
All the time.
All
so
the
if
time.
you take it and you say, okay, it's used 42 times, there might be one time, what was it, 2 Samuel 16,
it just refers to the other side of the hill.
Yeah, and that's the best case here.
Yeah.
So over and over, 40 times we're going to interpret these as equal entities of a building structure. Why would we interpret it different
As
in one time? In fact, hermeneutics, the laws of hermeneutics and understanding and interpreting the Bible would say, don't do that. You're way out of line to do it that way.
So what we have here is, since everything means a part or one side or the other, the picture that the author of Genesis here is pointing is that God cut Adam in half.
Yeah.
In equal halves.
And later, when we start reading through a cord of three strands of marriage, men and women coming together to be one, it doesn't give you any idea that the man's part is 60% and the woman's is 40%. Where does God fit into that? And so it becomes very problematic later on in theology if you don't just read it as two parts.
And then looking at this also, the meaning of Eve being the other half of Adam is Adam wasn't complete. He wasn't good without woman here on the earth. And so essentially this is a statement of God making Adam in half is about equality and mutuality.
Yeah. And, to read Eve as simply complementing Adam here, it doesn't fit the text. That's really a stretch to go that way.
Yeah. Next thing is helper, the word helper here. So complementarians will say that helper denotes, at face value, a status of submission. If you're helping somebody or working for your boss, it means that you're in submission to them.
Yeah.
And so egalitarians will see this word azer a lot different.
Yeah.
So it to them it means where the complementarians will see that azer means lacking or helper, but strength, because it's often applied to God.
So the Hebrew word azer is a contronym. You've heard us talk about this a few times, but it's when there's a word that represents something that means this, but it can also represent
a negative.
The polar opposite. It's usually positive, negative kind of thinking, sometimes not so much. So in English I like to use the word refrain. Refrain in a musical sense means
repeat it again and again.
Over and over. Or I can say, Matt, please refrain from doing this anymore. And that's kind of like this negative, don't do that anymore. And so that's the way this word is kind of used. And so even though we see it this way, as a positive and a minus, usually in the biblical sense, it's saying that your weakness may be made a strength. And so as complementarians are trying to take this understanding of it and get that way, I think in this case, it's actually not very well done most of the time.
Yeah, so if you look at Isaiah 30 verse 5, it talks about this word as God's military might. In Daniel 11:34, it's God's protection. It's him being an azer. Deuteronomy 33:29, God is the shield. It's Israel's help and their sword. Psalm 121, Psalm 124, it's the help that comes from the maker of heavens and earth. All of these words depict leadership and strength.
So hermeneutically, this is really important. What we're going to do is we're going to take the word and we're going to look at all the times that it's used. And even though it is a contronym and can mean lacking at some places, the overarching meaning is the other side, the strength, the kind of reiteration of taking one thing and turning it into the best that you have.
All right, so the next part in this section here on Genesis 2:18 through 24 is naming. So complementarians will say that the function of naming proves authority, since God named things when he created. So if Adam's naming the animals and then Adam names the woman, then that means authority.
Now a lot of people kind of make a joke out of this because they kind of go back and say, all right, God's going to tell tell him to name the animals and then create Eve, and they did it this way so they wouldn't have an argument that would take years to name all these animals. Now, that's not necessarily a complementarian or egalitarian. It's really just tongue-in-cheek. There's not a lot of biblical things to take away from that, but it does come into your consideration, I guess.
Yeah, so the thing with naming as authority, the egalitarians will point out that Hagar in Genesis 16:13 gives God a name.
Yeah.
Is Hagar an authority over God? No. We're saying that she recognizes God's role as her helper in her salvation, and maybe Adam's recognizing Eve as that, a helper to him. In the role of being the image of God.
So there's some things in theology that we would just kind of say that's a weak argument. It might be supportive to if you have other reasons to go that way. So it might be worth saying, but in this case, you know, from the complementarian side, we would just say there's not much credible water there within the scripture.
Yeah, so now let's go to the results of the fall. So we got Genesis 3:16. The woman said, then he said to the woman, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you.
So we go back to this a lot, in that when we look at the fall, a lot of times, we just did a video on wrath, and a lot of times people see God as kind of getting angry with them. In fact, if we did a poll and polled most, Christians, at least in America, they would all say that, God was angry at the fall, but in the text we don't necessarily get that.
No. When we look at the fall, we see God cursing the ground, but he's never said to curse Adam and Eve.
Yeah, in fact, we don't even get this idea that he was angry. We just get the idea that he's going to let them go out of the garden. He's going to...
the consequences.
Take his hand off and let them walk out into the rest of the world.
And it's actually mercy, like we said, is God not allowing them in there to live forever in rebellion against him, that he won't let them, he'll separate them from the tree of life, and that's literally what it says in the text. If you keep reading verses below this.
So one of the questions that comes into is created order. That's a big word here and going on, is that does the created order itself of Adam being first and then Eve, does that show hierarchy, or does it show that they were equals created the same?
It's interesting. If men ruling over women was part of the created order, then why do we only hear of it here the first time as a consequence of the fall and not as created order? It's the result of it.
So if you're going to make a doctrine out of this, so to speak, then typically it's not a good idea to take one Bible verse and make a doctrine over it. We say this over and over and over, especially if the major context of that verse was to totally do something else. Then don't take a little part of it and make a huge doctrine out of it. Yet in theology, you see that happen over and over. Of people trying to pull one thing, what I would say, out of context and build a whole doctrine about it. And most of the time, the better way to handle is just leave it alone.
So the other thing to think about is if Jesus came to reverse the fall, and if this is a result of the fall, then what place is there for complementarianism?
Yeah. So a complementarian that is going to say, Adam was created this way, but then Jesus comes to reverse that order, they're going to have to agree that in the end, women are actually going to be the head over men, and that's extremely disheartening to most complementarians.
So egalitarians will say this gender hierarchy thing as a result of the fall is just a result of disorder in creation. That it's not the way that it should be. Hierarchy of women over men or men over women, it isn't the creative order. It's men and women equal halves, as we saw, ruling and reigning as the image of God in earth.
So we started today looking at a foundation, explaining what a complementarian or an egalitarian is, and then looking at the beginning of Genesis at the creation and saying which one makes the most sense. Now, if all we had was this, I think most people would probably fall as egalitarians. The complementarian side of it just doesn't seem to be very reiterative. And I'm even going to go out on a limb, and some people would argue with me on this, but say that if you just took the whole Old Testament by itself, you would be hard-pressed to find any kind of complementarian thinking in it. The majority of the Old Testament isn't necessarily written that way. but then you kind of get into the New Testament, and that's where a lot, in fact, most complementarians are really going to kind of take root and set their ideas.
Especially in Paul.
Yeah, so from here, we just want to give you a basic context of creation and understanding the things, but the next video, we're really going to get into 1 Corinthians and kind of talk about headship and submission, the way it flushes out in the New Testament. But we're always going to say that the Old Testament and the New Testament, that it's consistent, that we see God's character unchanging from here to there in the spectrum, and it doesn't really matter whether you're a dispensationalist or not, you're still going to want to interpret the overall lens of the Bible.
Yep. Thanks for joining us for our first installment of Women in Ministry. We've got submission and head coverings and headship next time, and then we're going to get into Can Women Preach? Women eldership, and kind of conclude with what do we see throughout the Bible of maybe women who were in leadership. So,
looking forward to a great series.
Great. God bless you and keep you. Thanks for joining us.